Ports are being required to electrify on a timeline the grid can't support. The mandates are real. The grid isn't ready. And the gap between those two facts is now a capital planning problem, not a future one. California's Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, South Coast AQMD requirements, and federal clean port funding conditions are pushing port operators toward zero-emission cranes, shore power systems, and electrified drayage fleets on timelines that run from now through 2035. The pressure is regulatory, it's funded, and it's accelerating. What those mandates don't account for: utility interconnection backlogs running 2 to 5 years behind demand, substation upgrades that haven't been scoped, transmission projects that won't clear in time. Operators are being asked to commit capital to infrastructure that depends on power that may not arrive when the compliance clock runs out. That's not a hypothetical. It's the operating reality at ports right now. Related, infrastructure limits are now a board-level risk. Why capital is outpacing infrastructure capacity. The load math doesn't work. A single electrified ship-to-shore crane draws between 1,000 and 2,000 kilowatts. A port converting its full crane fleet while adding shore power for vessels and charging infrastructure for drayage trucks is adding load that rivals a small industrial city. That's not a problem the existing grid was built to absorb, and it's not a problem utilities can solve quickly. According to Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's 2025 interconnection queue analysis, more than 10,000 projects representing roughly 1,400 gigawatts of generation capacity are actively in line to connect to the U.S. grid. Average completion timelines are approaching 5 years. FERC's Order 2023 reform was designed to clear that backlog, but it's working through a queue that won't move on a schedule compatible with port compliance dates. Equipment decisions are being made today. Power delivery timelines are being set by utility queues that operators don't control and can't accelerate. 3 capital risks that aren't in most project models. This is where the compliance framing breaks down. Port electrification isn't just a regulatory execution problem, it's a capital structure problem. Operators are committing to cranes, charging systems, and substation upgrades before the grid capacity behind them is confirmed. 3 specific exposures follow from that. Stranded equipment. If grid specs change during interconnection, and they do, routinely, hardware procured against one set of assumptions may not fit the power profile that actually arrives. That's not a warranty issue, it's a write-down. Lease and contract liability. Terminal operators and logistics tenants working under multi-year agreements may carry compliance obligations tied to electrification milestones they don't control. The utility delay doesn't pause the compliance clock. The exposure stays. Grant clawback. Federal Clean Port funding increasingly includes milestone conditions and performance triggers. A grid delay outside the operator's control can still trigger clawback or penalty if a project misses a required completion date. Most grant agreements haven't been structured with that scenario in mind. Related, energy availability is quietly rewriting corporate timelines. On-site generation, the workaround is real, but it's not simple. Some operators are moving toward on-site battery storage, fuel cells, and backup generation as a bridge. Generate what you need until the grid catches up. The strategy makes sense. The execution is harder than it looks. Battery storage at industrial port scale is expensive, space-constrained at dense urban facilities, and still subject to its own permitting timelines. The assumption that on-site generation sidesteps the grid problem misses the fact that operators still have to size, site, and integrate these systems before the final grid configuration is known. Overbuild and you've got sunk costs. Underbuild and the compliance gap remains. Fuel cells are a longer horizon play. Hydrogen supply chains at industrial scale are still maturing. Neither path is a clean bridge if the decisions are made late. Federal funding is accelerating the risk, not just the opportunity. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and EPA's Clean Ports program have directed serious money toward port electrification. That's not the problem. The problem is that the funding creates pressure to move, and operators are moving faster than the grid infrastructure beneath them. Grant timelines and utility interconnection timelines are not synchronized. Most operators are pacing their projects to equipment procurement schedules. The binding constraint is almost always utility delivery. Those two clocks need to be running on the same wall. Related, why firm power is back at the center of grid strategy. AI infrastructure costs are reshaping capital planning. What operators need to do now. The mandates aren't moving. Waiting for regulatory clarity doesn't reduce the risk, it compounds it. What operators can actually control is how they sequence their response. Start interconnection studies now if you haven't. This is the only way to establish a real power delivery timeline. Every month of delay narrows the margin between the study completing and the compliance clock running out. Reframe capital planning around utility schedules, not equipment lead times. Most port electrification models are paced to procurement. The binding constraint is almost always grid delivery. The plan should reflect the real bottleneck. Review grant and lease agreements for grid delay exposure. Force majeure language, milestone definitions, and clawback terms were not written with utility interconnection delays in mind. That gap needs to be addressed before a deadline, not after. Engage state regulators on timeline coordination proactively. Several state agencies will accommodate documented grid delivery delays, but that accommodation requires early engagement. It is not available on appeal after a missed deadline. The bottom line: port electrification isn't a question of whether. The mandates, the money, and the market pressure are all pointed the same direction. The question is whether operators are managing the gap between what regulators required and what the grid can actually deliver on the same schedule. That gap is a capital planning problem. The operators who treat it as one now are the ones who won't be explaining stranded assets and missed milestones when the deadlines land. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.